Your Honor, counsel, members of the jury. When injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. Does it seem right that the reason we are in court today is because Keffy Thomas resisted an injustice? An injustice perpetrated by the Columbus Police Department on one of its own citizens, and that the Columbus Police Department wants to manipulate you, the jury, into thinking that Keffy Thomas is a criminal for doing her duty. But today, not only has prosecution failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Ms. Thomas is guilty of anything, but Ms. Thomas has also brought forth 4 testimonies that prove that she is not the guilty party here today. Stacey Casey, who testified that Keffy Thomas discussed the illegal activities on part of the Columbus Police Department with her and was specifically told not to disclose any information. Sandy Hinkle, the victim of civil rights violation by Sergeant Kendall Hoover, testified that Sergeant Hoover targeted her without legal cause. Blair Bellow, whose impeccable credentials at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government puts her in the perfect position to see the bigger picture of government corruption, testified that Keffy Thomas should be commended and not condemned for her actions. And finally, Ms. Keffy Thomas herself testified as to the untenable position she was put in when uncovering the police department's wrongdoings during the normal course of her duty, which she was hired and authorized to do by the Columbus Police Department. Now, members of the jury, remember that prosecution has the heavy burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt for the following elements. To convict Keffy Thomas of computer trespass, prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Keffy Thomas gained access without authorization, did so with the intent to commit a crime, and that the computer system was maintained by a government agency. Prosecution has failed to prove these elements. Instead, we, the defense, proved that Keffy Thomas was given access to these databases, did not intend to commit a crime, and that she was specifically hired because the Columbus Police Department does not know how to maintain its own computer systems. To convict Keffy Thomas of official misconduct, prosecution had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Keffy Thomas committed an unauthorized act and did so with the intent for personal benefit or to deprive of another person's lawful right. Again, prosecution has failed to prove these elements. Keffy Thomas accidentally uncovered the police department's wrongdoings during the normal course of her duty that she was hired and authorized to do by the Columbus Police Department, and certainly did not intend to benefit from it, but rather knew she was putting herself at risk. Even still, prosecution made its attempts by calling forth 4 witnesses. Alcali Peters, Columbus deputy mayor, who refused to even examine the illegal evidence brought forth by Keffy Thomas. Bailey George, the young detective caught up in Kendall Hoover's invasion of Sandy Hinkle's privacy, whose testimony corroborates that Kendall Hoover targeted Miss Hinkle without legal cause. Sergeant Kendall Hoover, who used Bailey George to access law enforcement resources for her own personal vendettas. And finally, Miss Cannon, who could only have testified to see Stacey and Miss Thomas talking, which is not proof of anything. None of the prosecution witnesses have proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And if you were targeted by the Columbus Police Department, wouldn't you want someone to recognize their duty and stand up for justice and hold the police department to the same laws that you and I must follow? In Peter's testimony today, she specifically said that she is not a public servant, which disproves this charge. Lastly, Witness Hoover was impeached today, which eliminates the credibility of any testimony brought forth by that witness. Also, none of the prosecution witnesses were successful in stating that it was in the state of Washington. Let it also be clear that Ms. Keffy Thomas was not impeached, and her statement is true and accurate to her affidavit. If you believe that Ms. Thomas is who they say she is, Remember that she has asserted necessity. She has provided ample amount of evidence to prove that she had no choice in protecting herself and her community from the wrongdoings of the Columbus Police Department. Now, the information that prosecution has brought forth today has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt the following elements to convict Kathy Thomas. This is why we ask to return a verdict of not guilty. Thank you.
Members of the jury, because